I'm not proud of what finally stopped my neighbor from using my driveway like it belonged to her. But I can tell you this. When a 6,000-pound luxury SUV slammed into my new steel gate at about 15 miles an hour, the gate barely flinched, the front of her vehicle folded like an aluminum can, both airbags exploded in her face, and the silence afterward was louder than the crash itself. The strangest part wasn't watching her Cadillac die right there in front of me. It was realizing she'd already done the exact same thing 3 times before, and every single person around us acted like I was somehow the unreasonable one for expecting my own driveway to stay. Well, mine. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and for almost 20 years I've worked as a structural engineer designing secure entrances for distribution centers, hospitals, and government facilities across Western Tennessee. My job has always been pretty simple. Figure out how things fail before they actually do. Steel tells the truth if you know how to read it. Concrete never lies. And physics doesn't care how rich you are, how loud you yell, or what position you hold on an HOA board. That's probably why I've always trusted engineering more than arguments. My wife used to joke that if the house ever caught fire, I'd probably stand outside calculating the load path before grabbing the garden hose. She wasn't entirely wrong. We lived in a quiet little neighborhood called Brookstone Meadows, 54 homes tucked behind old oak trees just outside Franklin. Most of the houses had been there since the 70s, modest brick ranch homes with wide yards, front porches, and enough space that neighbors could wave without having to know each other's business. Then the newer homes started showing up, bigger houses, bigger mortgages, bigger egos. 3 houses down from mine sat a massive stone mansion owned by Diane Mercer, a woman who somehow managed to treat every neighborhood gathering like she was hosting a campaign fundraiser. She had a fountain imported from Italy, a driveway shaped like a horseshoe, perfectly trimmed hedges that probably received more attention than most marriages, and a pearl-white Cadillac Escalade that looked polished every single morning before sunrise. Diane wasn't exactly mean in the traditional sense. She smiled constantly, the kind of smile that somehow made you feel like she'd already decided she was smarter than you before you even opened your mouth. She chaired the neighborhood social committee, organized charity luncheons, wine tastings, book clubs, holiday decorating contests, anything that put her name at the top of an email. People loved saying she kept the community together. I always thought she simply liked reminding everyone who she believed ran it. The first real problem started on a warm Saturday afternoon in April. I had just finished staining the cedar gate that closed off my driveway. It wasn't fancy, just a clean wooden swing gate I built myself after my wife passed away. Working on little projects around the house became therapy after losing her. Every board I sanded, every hinge I adjusted, every fresh coat of stain helped quiet the house for a little while. Around 1 o'clock, I heard laughter echoing down the street. Diane was hosting another one of her famous garden luncheons. Within an hour, every legal parking space near her property had filled up. I remember thinking she probably should have rented a venue instead of inviting half the county into a residential neighborhood. I was putting my tools away when I noticed her Escalade creeping toward my driveway. At first I assumed she was turning around. Then the engine revved, not aggressively, just confidently, like someone who expected the world to move out of her way. Before I had time to react, boom. The cedar gate exploded inward. Wood splintered across my driveway. One hinge ripped completely free from the post, and her SUV rolled straight through like the gate had never existed. She climbed out without the slightest hint of embarrassment. "Perfect," she called over her shoulder to the guests behind her. "You can all park in here now." 6 cars followed her into my driveway while I stood there holding a paintbrush like an idiot trying to understand what I'd just witnessed. I walked over and asked, probably more calmly than most people would have managed, "Diane, what exactly are you doing?" She looked at me almost sympathetically. "Ethan, don't be dramatic. Your gate was blocking perfectly usable space. It's only for the afternoon." I stared at the broken cedar scattered across the concrete. "You just drove through private property." She laughed softly, almost amused that I didn't understand. "The HOA will figure it out. Besides, maybe build a stronger gate next time." That last sentence stayed with me much longer than I expected. I called the sheriff's non-emergency line, mostly wanting documentation, but by the time a deputy arrived, the luncheon was winding down. Diane smiled, shook hands, acted like the model citizen she'd always pretended to be. The deputy recommended handling the property damage through insurance or civil court since nobody had been injured. The HOA president promised to review the matter at the next meeting. Translation: nothing was going to happen. I rebuilt the gate that following week. Same cedar, same dimensions, same quiet belief that surely nobody would intentionally drive through another person's property twice. Looking back now, that might have been the most unrealistic assumption I made during the entire ordeal. The following Saturday, I was finishing breakfast when I heard familiar voices drifting across the neighborhood, folding chairs scraping across Diane's patio, someone laughing a little too loudly before noon, and I remember standing at my kitchen window thinking, surely not again. I'd barely finished hanging the replacement gate the night before. Fresh cedar, reinforced hinges this time, pressure-treated posts sunk deeper into the ground. Nothing extravagant, just a little stronger because I figured maybe the first incident had been a ridiculous misunderstanding. Then, right around 1:30, I heard an engine that was becoming far too recognizable. I stepped outside just in time to watch that white Escalade line itself up with my driveway exactly the way it had before. There wasn't even a hesitation. No slowing down. No attempt to steer away. She simply accelerated and smashed straight through my brand new gate. The crack echoed across the street. Wood flew everywhere again. One of the posts actually snapped below grade this time. Diane rolled into my driveway like she'd pulled into a shopping center parking lot, climbed out carrying a casserole dish, spotted me standing there, and actually sighed like I was inconveniencing her. "Ethan," she said, "I really don't have time for another conversation today." I looked at the shattered pieces scattered across my lawn. Apparently, neither does my gate. A few of her guests awkwardly pretended not to notice. One older gentleman quietly apologized as he parked his sedan in my driveway. I could tell he knew this wasn't right, but nobody wanted to challenge the queen of neighborhood social events. Diane folded her arms. "You have plenty of room. My guest will only be here a few hours. That's not the point. It is if everyone benefits." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Somewhere along the line, she'd convinced herself that private property became community property whenever her guest list got too long. I documented everything again, took photographs, filed another report, emailed the HOA board with timestamps, estimates, and pictures. A week later, I attended the monthly HOA meeting hoping, maybe foolishly, that common sense would finally enter the room. Instead, I listened to 20 minutes of discussion about mailbox paint colors before my issue even came up. Diane smiled politely through the whole thing, then explained to the board that my driveway sat on a corner and functionally served the neighborhood during larger gatherings. One board member actually nodded. Another suggested I consider leaving the gate open during community events to encourage neighborly cooperation. I remember laughing, not because it was funny, but because sometimes your brain laughs when it's trying to stop itself from getting angry. "So if someone drives through my fence," I asked, "the solution is for me to stop having a fence?" Nobody answered. They moved to the next agenda item. That's when I understood something important. I wasn't dealing with a parking problem anymore. I was dealing with entitlement protected by popularity. About 2 weeks later came strike 3. Diane hosted a neighborhood book club, although judging by the number of SUVs lining the street, I suspected there was a lot more wine than reading involved. I had spent another weekend rebuilding the gate, partly because I wanted my property to look respectable, partly because some stubborn part of me refused to let someone bully me into leaving my driveway open. Around 2 o'clock, I heard tires crunching toward the entrance. I didn't even rush outside this time. I just walked calmly onto the porch carrying my phone. Sure enough, there came the Escalade. 15 miles an hour, maybe a little faster this time, straight into the cedar gate. The impact shattered it into dozens of pieces. Diane parked exactly where she'd parked twice before. I simply hit record on my phone. She climbed out, looked directly at me, and shrugged. "Maybe now you'll finally build one that lasts." She actually smiled after saying it. That smile changed everything. Up until then, I'd been trying to solve the problem like a homeowner. At that moment, I started thinking like an engineer. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger clouds judgment. I was curious. Curious how much force she'd been generating. Curious what kind of structure would stop 6,000 pounds of moving steel without becoming a hazard itself. Curious how to solve a human problem with mathematics. That evening, I spread blueprints across my dining room table. My wife used to call that table my second office. I hadn't drafted anything personal there since she'd passed, but somehow this project brought me back. Instead of designing loading dock barriers or security gates for warehouses, I was designing one for my own driveway. Every measurement had a reason. Every weld served a purpose. I wasn't designing a trap. I wasn't trying to damage anybody's vehicle. I simply intended to build a legal, permanent gate capable of resisting intentional impact without failing. There is a difference, and that distinction would later matter more than anyone realized. I ordered heavy square steel tubing, industrial hinges rated well beyond the expected load, reinforced locking hardware, and custom steel posts anchored into concrete foundations extending nearly 4 feet underground. I even contacted the county building department before installation began. I wanted permits, inspections, documentation. If someone ever questioned that gate, I wanted every piece of paper already sitting in a government file cabinet. My contractor friend Marcus came over to help pour the concrete. He looked at the drawings, whistled, and said, "Ethan, are you building Fort Knox?" I smiled. "No. Then what's all this for? I'm building something that won't lie." He laughed because he didn't understand what I meant. Structures tell the truth. If they're weak, they fail. If they're strong, they don't care who pushes against them. Over the next several days, the new entrance slowly took shape. Thick black powder-coated steel replaced cedar. Massive hinges disappeared behind reinforced mounting plates. Steel-reinforced concrete bollards hid beneath decorative stone columns, so the entrance still looked clean instead of industrial. From the street, it appeared elegant, maybe even understated. Only another engineer would have recognized what sat underneath. The finished gate weighed nearly 450 pounds. I cycled it open and closed dozens of times, checking alignment, measuring deflection, tightening bolts by fractions of a turn. Then I installed 4 security cameras covering every possible angle, each one synchronized with cloud storage so nothing could conveniently disappear later. My next-door neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, watched me work from her porch one evening. "Honey," she called, "I sure hope nobody hits that thing." I smiled without looking up. So do I. But deep down, I already knew exactly who would. Because people rarely change when everyone around them keeps rewarding bad behavior. Diane had driven through 3 gates without consequences. She believed the 4th would fall just as easily. What she didn't realize was that the 4th gate had never really been built for wood. It had been built for certainty, and certainty has a way of introducing itself all at once. About a week after the installation, invitations started appearing in mailboxes for Diane's annual charity luncheon, the biggest event she hosted all year. More than 20 guests had RSVP'd. Early Saturday afternoon, I noticed the familiar line of luxury cars arriving. I checked the camera feeds from my phone, set my coffee on the porch railing, and waited. Right at 2 o'clock, I saw the white Escalade turn the corner and head directly toward my driveway once again, following the exact same path she'd taken 3 times before. She never tapped the brakes. She never touched the brakes. Later, when I watched the security footage frame by frame, I could actually see the front end of her Escalade dip ever so slightly as she gave it a little more throttle. Exactly the same confidence. Exactly the same assumption that another wooden gate was about to explode in front of her. Instead, the moment the front bumper met 450 pounds of reinforced steel, time seemed to pause. There was one violent metallic crack that echoed through the neighborhood, followed immediately by the deep, ugly sound of expensive machinery destroying itself. The gate didn't swing backward. It didn't bend. It didn't even rattle the way I'd expected. It simply stood there, transferring every ounce of kinetic energy right back into the vehicle that created it. The hood folded upward, the grille disappeared beneath twisted metal, coolant burst across the driveway like green rain, and both airbags detonated so violently that I could hear them from my front porch. Then, silence. Complete silence. Even the guests standing in Diane's front yard froze. For a few seconds, nobody moved. I walked down my driveway slowly, not running, not celebrating, just making sure no one had been seriously hurt. Diane sat behind the steering wheel staring straight ahead, both airbags hanging limp around her shoulders. She looked less angry than confused, like physics had somehow betrayed her personally. I knocked gently on the driver's window. "Are you all right?" She pushed the door open with trembling hands and stepped out. What did you do?" she whispered. I looked at the gate, then back at the Escalade. "I built a gate." Her voice immediately changed. "You trapped me." I shook my head. "No, Diane. I protected my property." Several of her guests wandered closer. Some looked genuinely concerned for her. Others couldn't stop staring at the gate that still stood perfectly straight. Marcus arrived a few minutes later after Mrs. Alvarez called him. He walked around the entrance once, rubbed the powder-coated finish with his thumb, then chuckled. "You've got a scratch." I laughed for the first time in weeks. "Looks expensive." The sheriff's deputy who had responded to the earlier reports recognized my address before he even stepped out of his cruiser. "Mr. Caldwell," he sighed. "Please tell me this isn't another gate." "Technically," I answered, "it's the same driveway." I handed him copies of every previous incident report, photographs of the 3 destroyed cedar gates, HOA correspondence, county permits for the new installation, engineering calculations, inspection approvals, and finally the security footage from every camera angle. We watched the video together inside his patrol vehicle. There wasn't much to debate. The footage clearly showed the Escalade accelerating toward a closed gate located entirely on private property. No obstruction had suddenly appeared. No mechanical failure forced her forward. No emergency justified the maneuver. She simply did what she'd successfully done 3 times before, except this time the gate refused to cooperate. The deputy stepped out, looked at Diane, then quietly said, "Ma'am, you intentionally drove into a fixed structure on private property." She immediately pointed at me. "He built it to destroy my vehicle." I answered before the deputy could. "I built it to survive yours." Those 2 sentences ended up appearing almost word for word in the official report. A tow truck arrived an hour later. As the operator winched the Escalade onto the flatbed, transmission fluid and coolant left a long shimmering trail across my driveway. One of Diane's guests finally walked over and apologized. "Honestly," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, "I thought she'd asked permission all those other times." I smiled politely. Most people did. That may have been the saddest part of the whole experience. Entitlement survives because so many decent people assume someone else has already verified the facts. A few days later, Diane's insurance company contacted me requesting copies of the security footage. I sent everything without editing a single second. About a week after that, I received a phone call from one of their investigators. He sounded exhausted. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, "we've reviewed the evidence several times, and we're denying her claim. Apparently, insurance policies cover accidents. They don't usually cover repeatedly choosing to drive through someone else's gate." Diane wasn't finished, though. She hired an attorney who sent me a thick envelope accusing me of negligence, creating an unreasonable hazard, and intentionally constructing a dangerous obstacle. I almost laughed until my own attorney reminded me that lawsuits, even weak ones, still deserve serious responses. So instead of arguing emotionally, we responded with documentation, engineering reports, building permits, inspection certificates, security footage from 4 different cameras, copies of every complaint I'd filed after the first, second, and third gate had been destroyed, repair invoices, photographs, emails, HOA meeting minutes. Every single piece fit together like parts of a bridge. Facts have a remarkable way of supporting each other when they're actually true. About 3 weeks later, my attorney called while I was at work. "You sitting down?" he asked. "Should I be? Her lawyer wants to settle." I leaned back in my office chair and looked out the window for a long moment. After everything, after months of frustration, after being treated like the unreasonable neighbor for simply wanting my own driveway respected, the fight ended with one phone call. We negotiated compensation for the 3 destroyed cedar gates, installation costs associated with the reinforced replacement, legal expenses, property damage, and additional civil claims related to repeated trespass. The final settlement came just under $50,000. She paid every cent within 2 months. The court also approved a permanent order prohibiting her from entering or using my driveway for any reason. Ironically, the only person who had ever wanted access to it was now legally forbidden from setting foot on it. Life slowly returned to normal after that. The neighborhood felt quieter. People waved again instead of pretending not to notice tension hanging over every gathering. Even the HOA board became strangely interested in reviewing property rights and parking policies once lawyers became involved. Funny how quickly priorities change when accountability finally shows up. About 8 months later, I noticed a moving truck parked outside Diane's house. By sunset, the fountain was wrapped in blankets, furniture filled the trailer, and a for sale sign stood where her charity banners used to hang. She never came over to say goodbye. We never spoke again. Sometimes friends ask if building that gate was worth everything it cost. They're usually expecting me to talk about money, but that was never the point. The real value wasn't the settlement check or the legal victory. It was waking up every morning knowing I no longer had to wonder whether someone would decide my property belonged to them simply because they wanted it more. Engineers spend their careers calculating loads, stresses, and failure points. But that experience taught me something no textbook ever mentioned. The strongest structures aren't always the ones made of steel. Sometimes they're the boundaries you're finally willing to defend, calmly, legally, and without taking a single step onto someone else's property. Now I'm curious what you think. Did I go too far by replacing a wooden gate with one designed to withstand impact? Or was Diane responsible for every consequence the moment she decided to ram a closed gate for the fourth time? Let me know down in the comments because stories like this always seem to divide people right down the middle. And if you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes good fences, and even better gates, still make good neighbors.